Hi, everybody. It is October 4th, and 2025, and I have to tell you, it has been a challenge in this class because there's much happening in current events that are deeply related to public health. And I prepare these units usually about 3 weeks before you do them. So anything that is current at the time I do it is no longer current by the time you get to it. And a lot of the things that are happening, in order to understand them deeply, you have to know the things that we're going to do later in the semester. But there's something going on right now that I just felt like I needed to take a moment. And some of these concepts you don't have yet, some of these things we haven't learned about, but we're just going to move forward with it. So currently we are in a government shutdown, which is a bad thing for our country in many ways. And the reason for that is because of a controversy about healthcare funding. So I want to take you through that so that you can kind of understand the issues. And it does relate to something you learned about in the Unit 5 lecture, a particular law. So that's going to come, two laws actually are going to come up. So let's take a look. So the government is shut down. Why? So first, you have to understand what the normal budget process is for Congress. So Congress has what's called the power of the purse, meaning that Congress is the branch of our government. Remember, we're supposed to have the separation of powers. Congress is the branch of government that decides what we spend money on and how much money we're going to actually spend. So that's the power of the purse. So normally the way a budget process works is the president proposes a budget and gives it to Congress. Congress doesn't have to follow that at all. They can completely ignore it, or they can use it as kind of a first draft to work off of. It doesn't matter. And then what's supposed to happen is both the House of Representatives and the Senate come up with their own sets of what are called appropriations bills. Appropriation means we're appropriating this much money for these different things. There are normally 12 of them because they divide the federal government into 12 different sections. So there are normally 12 appropriations bills. House comes up with one for each of the 12 sections, Senate comes up with one for each of the 12 sections, and then they have to come together and agree on a joint bill. So that is all supposed to be passed in the fall of every year. That's what's supposed to happen. It almost never happens. So unfortunately, we have a process that is dysfunctional. It doesn't work. And so Congress repeatedly fails to complete this whole process. And so instead, and they did it for the 2025 budget, they completely didn't get any of these things passed. So what happens instead is they do what's called a stopgap continuing resolution, where instead of going through this whole big process, they just say, okay, we're just going to spend, it's just kind of very high level, we're just going to spend money on these things, and it's a temporary stopgap measure until they're supposed to do the real process. So current spending for our federal government for 2025 was funded through September 30th through a continuing resolution that Congress passed actually in March 2025. So they were totally behind the eight ball, right? We were well into 2025. And the fiscal year ends in September, which is weird. But anyway, so what needed to happen is that Congress either needed to finish the normal budget process that they're supposed to do, which was not absolutely going to happen, or pass a new continuing resolution to continue to fund the government. And that didn't happen, and that's why we're in a shutdown. So why did we get here? They can't agree on a continuing resolution because there are some significant issues of disagreement about funding for healthcare. This comes back to the fact that this past July, Congress passed what is referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Now, that was passed as a kind of a typical statute, and so it only required a simple majority. The Senate was actually kind of deadlocked on it, and so the vice president broke the tie, and this bill passed. This bill contains a lot of provisions. So one that is controversial is that it continued some pre-existing tax cuts for the highest earners in our country that had been set to expire after 2025. It extended those. It also increased a lot of spending for the military, Department of Homeland Security, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then to partially offset those costs, those increased costs, but it actually didn't fully offset those increased costs. It reduced funding for food assistance. So we have a program, you might know it as food stamps. It's technically called SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is additional funding for low-income families to get help with purchasing food. And it also increased requirements for people to qualify in terms of their income, in terms of whether they are working, and it actually increases the work of the counties that administer them. I'm on our County Health and Human Services Board to make sure that they're complying with all these different things. So it's actually making SNAP a more expensive program to administer. But anyway, it also cuts Medicaid by 12%. We haven't talked about Medicaid yet. Medicaid is our funding system for health insurance and health care for the most low income people in our country, as well as those with permanent disabilities. So it's not just people who are poor, it's also people who have really significant medical problems and disabilities. And in fact, about 50% of the people on Medicaid in our country are children. So it's a big provider of health insurance for children in our country. And it cut that funding by 12%, which is the largest cut in the program's history. And then it also eliminated the subsidies for health insurance via the Affordable Care Act. So you just learned about the Affordable Care Act, and I shared a couple of provisions of the Affordable Care Act with you, but there's one that I didn't, and that is the sticking point here. So let's talk about it. In the Affordable Care Act, there are subsidies. So if you make less than 400% of the federal poverty level, which would be less than about $40,000 a year, you get a subsidy, you get assistance paying for your health insurance through that healthcare.gov, that exchange. So these are subsidies. This is money that you get from the federal government to help offset the cost of your insurance. Those, when the bill was passed, they're set to expire at the end of 2025, and they were not renewed. They were ended in the bill that was passed in July. So if you look, for example, you can see here we've got the 2025 monthly cost for someone on the health exchange to get health insurance through Anthem. And you can see that the price quoted is $307 per month, but then you see that after $464 savings. That $464 savings is the subsidy that you get from the federal government. So now the same person looking to purchase the same health insurance plan in 2026, their total is going to be $964 a month. That's a lot of money. And that's money that most people don't have, right? Let's say that somebody makes, I don't know, let's say they even make $40,000 a year. Well, that's $12,000, right? So we didn't even take taxes out yet. And then, so it's like a third of your total income is just paying for health insurance. So that is not going to be doable, right? Even the $300 a month is kind of a lot. So this is big that these subsidies are set to expire. So we know that about 22 million American citizens currently rely on those subsidies, and the likelihood is very high that they will not be able to afford health insurance when it doubles in cost, right? That's going to be a huge increase in cost for them. And, what we worry about is people have to make decisions about, do I pay for health insurance or do I buy groceries, right? Or do I pay for rent? Like, where does the money come from? So significant impacts that's fewer than 10% of American citizens, but still that's a sizable number of people. That's a lot of people. But the other thing that we know, and I know we haven't talked about health insurance yet, this is why it's like, okay, so here you go. When you have fewer people signing up for insurance, the risk pool increases because the people who are going to be most motivated to go ahead and buy insurance are going to be the ones who are most likely to need it. So those kind of higher cost people. And I know that we talked about insurance a little bit before already. So anytime you decrease the pool and you allow low-risk people to opt out or low-risk people self-select out due to increased costs, that drives up the premiums for everybody, because the insurance companies are for-profit companies and they need to make a profit and they need to protect their bottom line. So we're looking at health insurance premiums, which is what you pay when you purchase health insurance, either individually through the marketplace or through your employer. Those premiums are looking to go up significantly as a result of these subsidies expiring and then the risk pool changing for everyone else. So it's a big deal. So you may have seen some ads or some social media about how this is just funding for undocumented immigrants, and that the people who are upset just want to use federal healthcare dollars to pay for medical care for people who are in this country without legal status. So is it for undocumented immigrants? No, mostly. So I'm going to give you the nuanced answer here, right? Because you deserve it. You deserve the reality of the situation. So first of all, the ACA subsidies for purchasing health insurance are not available to people without legal status. So you either have to be a citizen or have a green card. You have to be like fully legally present here in the country. Now, states get to administer their own Medicaid, and so different states do it differently. Part of the funding comes from the federal government, part of the funding comes from the state itself for Medicaid. It's a hybrid plan. There are some states that allow some of their Medicaid funding to be used for undocumented immigrants, usually only in specific circumstances, such as somebody who's pregnant and needs obstetrical care, and we know that having access to that care has huge implications for the well-being of that child. Or folks who are like having a heart attack, right? So, and the reason for that, because you're like, but wait a minute, EMTALA means that they have to be seen in the emergency room if they're having a heart attack. You're right, but EMTALA doesn't require the federal government to pay the hospital for that care. And so what happens is hospitals lose money when people come into the emergency room who don't have health insurance or can't pay. So some states, in order to protect, especially their rural hospitals where this is more of an issue, have allowed Medicaid, certain Medicaid programs to be used for emergency care for undocumented persons, because then that helps the hospitals to protect their ability to stay afloat. Most hospitals are nonprofit in this country, just so you know. So we know that it's way less than 1% of all Medicaid funding ever ends up going to people who are undocumented. So does some funding go to undocumented immigrants? Yes. Is it a lot? No, it's a tiny, tiny fraction, and there's good reasons for why a state may decide to use some of the money in that way. So then we have another paragraph here about EMTALA again. So just again, reminding you, anybody who shows up in the emergency room, they have to be seen regardless of ability to pay. So yes, undocumented folks do and can use emergency rooms, absolutely. Although I will tell you that many don't go out of fear that then they're going to be reported or then they're going to be in the system and immigration enforcement is going to be called on them. So a lot don't go. And even when a lot goes, sometimes they won't follow through with recommended treatment or a diagnostic test. I once treated a foreign worker from a farm who had a significant injury. I was pretty sure his arm was broken, but he refused to get an x-ray because he didn't have money to pay for anything, and he knew that was going to cost more money. And so we had to just send him out with a sling, which is like totally inappropriate care. But anyway, also, again, I'm just going to reiterate, the hospital doesn't or the federal government does not reimburse hospitals for that uncompensated care that they give for people that they see via EMTALA who don't have ability to pay. So if you go to the emergency room and you never pay your bill, the federal government doesn't reimburse the hospital for that. The hospital has to eat it. Okay, unless you're in one of those few states that has some exceptions where you can use Medicaid funding. Okay. So why the shutdown now? So many of those cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I forgot to be there, are really unpopular actually with the vast majority of Americans. And we know it's going to cause significant hardships for many folks, particularly the decrease in Medicaid funding, which helps care for our most vulnerable people in our population, including people with really chronic and severe mental illnesses who need access to medications and regular psychiatric care, as well as the loss of the ACA subsidies. So those are very concerning about their impact on Americans and our communities. So it turns out that a continuing resolution is different from other bills that get passed by Congress. It requires a 60+ majority to pass. So this has played out mostly as a Republicans versus Democrats thing. And so the Democrats, as the minority party, right, they don't have the majority. This is their only leverage. Right? So this is their only opportunity, really, is a continuing resolution to force Republicans to say, okay, maybe we'll put those subsidies back, or maybe we'll restore Medicaid funding to what it is. Now, you could argue that when the current continuing resolution expires and a new one needs to be passed, they will have the opportunity again, because continuing resolutions require a 60+ vote. So part of the reason for why now is because these subsidies are set to expire like in months. So there is some urgency here in that process. So yeah, that's why they refused to pass the current continuing resolution that got passed by the House of Representatives, went to the Senate, and the Democrats said, no, 10 or more of us are not going to approve this because, hey, we have this big problem coming that's going to hurt Americans. So at present, there are two competing continuing resolutions. One is what's being referred to as the clean bill, being put forth by the Republican majority, which would just continue current funding, until November 21st, kicking the can down the road, and doesn't change anything about what we're funding or how. And then there's the competing proposal from the Democrats, which would last not quite as long, but would restore the Medicaid funding and the ACA subsidies. So they can't agree. No movement is happening. And the Speaker of the House actually sent the House of Representatives into recess until October 14th, sent them all home out of DC. So at this point in time, as I'm recording this, nothing can happen. Right? So no agreements can be made. So it will be exciting to see by the time you're watching this video, what, if anything, has happened or changed since this time. So this is like a little time capsule. All right. Will be interesting to see. All right. I hope that was helpful. It's messy. It's complicated. Life is hard. Okay. I'll talk to you later. Bye.